friends. You're listening to How the West Was Cast, a podcast dedicated to the best of the Western movie genre.
The legend spread of the man with the hanging scar who wore a badge and rode a vengeance trail after 9 desperate men.
Those 9 men, if you find them, they're to be brought before me.
Rachel, she wanted revenge, a different kind, for a different reason.
Who do you want to hang?
Vengeance, Western style. It started with an act of unspeakable violence and ended on a rope.
That was the trailer to Hang 'em High, a bloody 1968 Western starring Clint Eastwood. And on this score-settling episode of How the West Was Cast, our topic is revenge. Hello, my name is Matthew Chernoff, and I'm a screenwriter and an entertainment journalist in Los Angeles.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson, a film historian and the chair of the Department of Film and Media Arts at the University of Utah.
And joining us today is a very special guest who we're excited to have on the show. He's the author of the best-selling Harper and Lane mystery series, published by Thomas and Mercer, and he's also written several recent novels in the popular Ralph Compton Western series, including titles like The Devil's Snare, Blood on the Prairie, and Die Trying. And all of them are available from Berkeley Publishing, an imprint of Penguin Random House. So without further ado, it is our pleasure to welcome author Tony Healey to the show. Hello, Tony.
Hello.
Great to have you with us, Tony.
It's great to be on here.
So, Tony, when we first spoke about having you join us for an episode, the topic was going to be a little bit different. Since you'd written several novels in Ralph Compton's Gunfighter series, the initial plan was to build a show around some of our favorite gunfighter movies. But after reading The Devil's Snare, I discovered that the theme of the novel was actually revenge, which was a great topic for this podcast because there are a ton of great revenge westerns to discuss. So with that in mind, for listeners of this show who haven't yet read your book, can you give us a brief snapshot about what The Devil's Snare is all about?
It's about a lady that finds her brother and his family slaughtered, and she aligns with a mysterious hired gun who shares her trauma in that his own family was slaughtered years ago. And it just so happens that they have a common enemy in a cattle baron that dominates the town.
Well, I have to tell you, I really enjoyed the book. It's loaded with memorable set pieces and some pretty harrowing violence, which is right up my alley. As far as I'm concerned, when it comes to revenge westerns, the bloodier the better. Now, we'll be discussing your Ralph Compton novels and how you came to write them later on in the show. But before that, Andrew, why don't you go ahead and introduce the topic of today's episode?
An episode on revenge in Western movies is an opportune time to tell my all-time favorite Western joke. Picture, if you will, a Western saloon. A bartender serves shots of whiskey, cowboys sit at tables playing cards, dance hall girls lingering about, a slim, sweaty man at the piano plays a lively tune. Suddenly, everything goes quiet. All eyes are on the saloon door. A stranger has just entered. 2 pistols are slung low on the stranger's hips. A wide-brimmed hat casts a shadow over his eyes. He is, by all appearances, a gunman. But those in the bar quickly take note of 2 unusual features. First, the stranger's right arm is in a sling. Second, the stranger is a dog, an actual dog. "Can I help you, stranger?" calls the bartender. The dog squints and in a gruff voice responds, "I'm looking for the fellow that shot my paw." Now that the greatest Western joke of all time is about vengeance shouldn't surprise us, given how central retribution is to the plots of many Western movies, from the celebrated to the overlooked to the obscure. Stagecoach, My Darling Clementine, and The Searchers, arguably the 3 most celebrated Westerns made by John Ford, are each about a hero avenging the death of a family member. So are Bud Bedeker's 7 Men from Now and Ride Lonesome. Vengeance is at the heart of director Anthony Mann's famed collaborations with Jimmy Stewart, as well as many of Clint Eastwood's Westerns, including, as we just heard, Hang 'em High, but also High Plains Drifter, and, of course, Unforgiven. Once you start looking for it, you see revenge everywhere in the Western, from Raoul Walsh's The Big Trail in 1930 up to friend of the podcast Jared Moshe's The Ballad of Lefty Brown in 2017, and all trends and phases in between. Red River, Last Train to Gun Hill, One-Eyed Jacks, True Grit, Silverado, True Grit again. I could go on and on. But rather than do that, I'll pose a question. Why? Why are so many Westerns about revenge? Now, as much as a hero in search of vengeance is a venerable plot that transcends time and genre, the Western does seem especially preoccupied with revenge. What, if anything, can we infer from this? Well, we might start by observing that vengeance in Westerns is often extra-legal. Revenge is personal, and official agents of law and order can't, or sometimes won't, help our hero in his quest. In some movies, including two we'll discuss today, those official agents are actually party to the transgression against the hero. And even when the hero does wear a badge, vengeance often requires moving beyond the limits of the law. In My Darling Clementine, Wyatt Earp, despite being the town marshal, declines offers of official assistance prior to his final showdown with the Clantons. He calls the feud strictly a family affair, and in so doing, arguably abdicates his lawful right to kill. We recognize, of course, that the justice Earp seeks isn't judicial, but cosmic, or even biblical. It may be, then, that the Western offered, and continues to offer, a reassurance of the existence of a higher law, above that of the well-intentioned but ever-corruptible institutions of man. And if that's a stretch, I am, of course, always skeptical of any argument about art that reduces complex phenomena down to simple axioms, we could at least say that the genre and its conventions have proved fertile ground for stories of revenge.
So for this episode, we've selected a few revenge westerns that we think are well worth recommending. Many of these films are available on streaming platforms like Amazon and YouTube, so if they sound interesting, by all means, check them out and let us know what you think. Okay then, Andrew, what's your first revenge western?
My first film is The Furies. It's impossible to discuss revenge in the Western without bringing up Anthony Mann. As much as vengeance is fundamental to the genre, no filmmaker's body of westerns is as closely associated with the theme as is Mann's. This is largely on the strength of the director's aforementioned 5 westerns made with Jimmy Stewart, starting with Winchester 73 in 1950 and concluding with The Man from Laramie in 1955. The Western historian John H. Lenehan has aptly described these films as being about a lonely man driven to extremes of physical and mental anguish as he hunts those responsible for some personal or family tragedy. I could have easily chosen any of these films, but instead went with The Furies from 1950. The Mann-Stewart westerns are significant films, but I'm actually partial to Mann's other westerns from the same period, like Devil's Doorway, The Tin Star, and Man of the West. These movies have been overshadowed by the Stewart westerns, which is unfortunate because they're just as good and, because of their variety, are often more interesting. That's one reason to pick The Furies. A second is Barbara Stanwyck, who, as my film students know, is the greatest actress ever, and for all time. A third is that the film is suffused with revenge. On one side is the despotic New Mexico cattle baron T.C. Jeffords, who owns a sprawling ranch called The Furies. On the other are the Herreras, a Mexican family with ancestral claims to the land, but who T.C. sees as squatters. And on another side is Rip Darrow, a saloon owner whose father was killed by T.C., and who believes he is the rightful owner of a fertile part of the Furies called the Darrow Strip. And at the center of it all is Stanwyck as Vance Jeffords, T.C.'s headstrong, spoiled daughter, whose affections are split between her father, her childhood friend Juan Herrera, and Darrow. Instead of a hero's single-minded quest for vengeance, The Furies is a western where almost everyone is out to get someone else.
I hadn't seen The Furies. I have to admit, before you decided to pick it. So when you said that you were going with an Anthony Mann revenge Western, I was, of course, thinking Jimmy Stewart with a gun in his hand blasting away and some psychological noir Western. And so, boy, was I thrown when I put this movie on. It caught me off guard, but I'm glad you picked it because it opens up some interesting avenues for revenge that I hadn't considered, namely financial revenge. Stanwyck's plan that she comes up with to get back at TC is brilliant. I didn't know where she was going with it. I don't know if we were supposed to know where she's going with it. But when it's finally revealed what her whole plot is with the TC notes and the, destroying his entire empire, what a moment that was when that finally hit me. It's like something out of an Ocean's 11 movie or one of those David Mamet twisty thrillers where it sneaks up on you what her actual devious plan was to get revenge on her dad. Brilliant plotting there.
Yeah, the machinations of the plot are a little complex, but it does all come together in the end. It's got a lot of interesting things happening. There's kind of Shakespearean overtones. There's some overtones of Greek tragedy. The Furies, of course, were 3 Greek goddesses of revenge, and there are, of course, 3 prominent female characters in this film, all of whom exact various measures of revenge against the men in their lives. So to me, it's just a very rich film anchored by a really compelling performance by Miss Stanwyck.
Tony, had you seen this movie before, or was I the only one who hadn't seen it?
No, I'd never even heard of it. I don't think it's a film I would have probably given the time of day. And I think it's one that I would definitely revisit, to be honest with you, because I think it's even the cinematography on it was just fantastic. It was just don't know. Out of all of them, it was one that I really, really enjoyed.
Yeah, the cinematography, you're right. It's stunning. It feels very Orson Welles-like at times.
Yeah.
A lot of it felt like something out of Magnificent Ambersons or Rebecca. There's even like a creepy gothic feel to the TC's house with those looming portraits on the wall that feel like right out of Rebecca, where the old family is still kind of watching the newcomer come in.
Yeah, and like moonlight, and it was, I don't know, it was just really, I was quite unexpected.
That moonlight you talked about, that spooky element, that sort of gothic melodrama, plays out in some particularly disturbing, incestuous undertones. I'm not even sure if you can call them undertones. They're practically overtones. What can you tell me about that aspect of the film, Andrew?
Well, it's certainly often grouped in with some other films, like maybe Johnny Guitar as a Freudian Western, let's say. So in this case, this is a Western dealing with what we would call the Electra complex, a daughter's fraught relationship with her father that does take on some of those uncomfortable connotations that you referred to. You throw in a somewhat, effeminate son into the mix, and it becomes all manner of weird contained within this massive ranch house, which I think you're right to draw those connections to kind of the melodramas from around this time. It's certainly filmed that way, the interiors. So that's sort of what it is. What we can make of that? Well, we have to remember that these ideas were in common currency, especially following the Second World War. So anytime you see this kind of Freudian subtext in a Western, it's not our enlightened contemporary perspective. These are ideas that screenwriters trafficked in at that time and were using to try to enliven what were in many ways conventional dramatic stories. So I think there's a lot of juicy stuff in here. Does it all come together? Maybe not, but it's certainly in there.
And we got that great ending too. Like that was another part that it pulled the rug out from under me. That the final violent revenge that we get on TC, which was sort of reminiscent in a way of Jimmy Ringo's death in The Gunfighter, where at the last second of the movie, somebody who has a grudge against him that we may or may not have sort of forgotten about takes a cheap shot in the back and blasts him away. We get that, maybe I should have said spoiler alert there up front, but The Gunfighter was the movie that popped to my mind at that moment. Yeah. And they even have the final farewell to him as he's lying there. It was very reminiscent of The Gunfighter's death. Yeah, it was a great way to end this movie.
Yeah, same year, and I think it sort of brings up a question that recurs in the Western, and that's the ramifications of these quests for vengeance. So what I especially like about the ending is it really does pull the rug out from under you, because there's a sense that everything's going to be fine, everybody's going to get what they want, and you've kind of forgotten as a viewer that the kind of the son of the Mexican family has actually been hung. right? And egregiously hung. And then there at the moment of supposed kind of union between the remaining parties, there's the Herrera mother with her shotgun.
Here is drama as vast and spectacular as the sweeping ranges and towering crags of the lawless empire that spawned it, the Furies. And to film this greatest of all novels by Niven Bush, who wrote Duel in the Sun, producer Hal Wallace has assembled a superlative cast of dramatic stars. Barbara Stanwyck, Wendell Corey, Walter Houston in his greatest role.
You stop telling lies about me, and I'll stop telling the truth about you.
I've heard that one before. Now get. I killed your father in a fair fight, and I'd be pleased to do as much for you.
All right, gentlemen, so that was my first revenge Western. Matt, what is your first film?
My first revenge Western is VALDEZ is Coming. Released by United Artists in 1971 and based on a novel by Elmore Leonard, the film was the second of 3 Westerns that Burt Lancaster made in the early 70s. The other 2 being Lawman, which arrived in theaters 1 month before VALDEZ, and Ulzana's Raid, which debuted a year later. Here, Lancaster plays Bob Valdez, an aging Mexican-American constable who is treated like a joke by virtually every white face he meets. After being coerced into killing an innocent black man who's wrongly accused of murder by a despicable rancher, Valdez requests $200 in compensation for the dead man's pregnant Indian widow. But rather than pay that measly sum, the rancher instead has his guns for hire torture Valdez for merely asking for it. Tied to a wooden cross and sent out to the desert to die, Valdez survives his grueling ordeal and eventually seeks bloody revenge against the man he holds responsible. The film was directed by newcomer Edwin Sharon, who was best known for his work on Broadway prior to this movie. Curiously enough, Sharon was not the first director attached to Valdez. Originally, Sidney Pollack was going to direct it, and Lancaster was going to play the villainous rancher, Frank Tanner. As for the title role, Marlon Brando was slated to play Valdez. But that plan fell apart when Lancaster was cast in the 1970 disaster epic Airport, which postponed the making of Valdez and scuttled the original deal. Shot on location in Spain and loaded with sweaty violence, the film bears many of the hallmarks of the spaghetti western subgenre that was already on the wane by 1971. The film's protracted crucifixion scene in particular recalls moments from Euro westerns like Johnny Hamlet, Yankee, and Django and Sartana Are Coming. Although universally regarded as a revenge western, I admit that I had a moment's hesitation about including Valdez is Coming on this episode because the question of whether or not Valdez is seeking personal vengeance or legal justice is a little bit murky here. Despite being viciously tortured by the movie's villain, Valdez remains so laser-focused on righting that initial wrong, a case could almost be made that vengeance isn't his top priority. That said, the near-constant humiliation he endures throughout the first half of the film, coupled with the physical cruelty he suffers at the hands of Tanner's men, pushes Valdez close enough into revenge territory that I decided it was well worth including on the show. Now, revenge movies come in many different subcategories, and Valdez is a prime example of one that I call, "You effed with the wrong dude." Movies in this category revolve around underestimated heroes who are much more equipped to handle violent confrontations than expected. The protagonist in these films often has a secret past that he tries to keep hidden until he's eventually forced to draw on those deadly skills and rain hellfire down on anyone in his path. For most viewers, though, the real draw of Valdez is Burt Lancaster's performance. Always a larger-than-life actor, Lancaster acquits himself quite well here in a role that would be impossible for an actor like him to play in today's climate. His transformation from a pitiful, broken-down pushover to a deadly killing machine is a lot of fun to watch. The scene where he finally dons his old cavalry uniform and busts out a massive Sharps buffalo gun is hugely satisfying. And then there's the film's ending, or non-ending, as the case may be. Now, most revenge westerns wrap up with the hero either achieving retribution or dying in pursuit of it. But not Valdez is Coming. Instead, the film ends on a narrative ellipsis. The explosive final resolution that we've been waiting for is merely hinted at rather than shown. It's an offbeat way to conclude a revenge Western, but it's actually lifted word for word from Elmore Leonard's novel. In a way, though, that unresolved ending feels strangely satisfying. By denying the audience a traditional cathartic climax, Valdez is Coming suggests that perhaps revenge is more complex than merely blowing away the bad guy. For an arrogant bastard like Frank Tanner, death would be the easy way out.
So I, of course, am partial to Westerns of the 1970s, having written a book on the subject. And this is a great example, along with another film that we'll talk about later in this episode, of just the variety of Western production at this time and how fertile ground the Western still was for telling new and interesting stories. And it's a reminder that John Wayne wasn't the only elder actor still sporting his spurs and six-gun into the 1970s. Burt Lancaster, as you said, Matt, continued to star in Westerns, not only in the 70s, but even into the 80s with Catalani and the Little Breeches. And so did others that we've addressed in earlier episodes. Rock Hudson, Dean Martin, Jimmy Stewart. These guys continue to make Westerns. This is an odd film to watch today because of the brownface component. Right. And that isn't just a matter of, times have changed. Even for 1971, this was a bit of a stretch. And it's not just Lancaster. It's also Hector Elizondo as the Mexican writer employed by Tanner, kind of his lead man whose allegiance switches over the course of the film. A really charismatic performance, but one that's also kind of undermined by some even more ostentatious brownface makeup. Now, that isn't to cast aspersions on the past, but only to say that even in the context, this was a bit of a stretch for 1971.
I really loved this subgenre, as I called it, the you effed with the wrong dude Westerns. When it comes to revenge, that's one of my favorite things. I guess that's maybe why I love First Blood so much. John Rambo is the ultimate you effed with the wrong dude character. He's the guy you did not want to piss off. There's just something really attractive, I think, about these lead characters who appear harmless and docile like Valdez does at first, and he's kowtowing and bowing to everybody, who secretly have this simmering rage lurking there and the capacity to really, bring it when it needs to be. Tony, had you seen this film before?
No, and it's the first Burt Lancaster film I've ever seen as well.
Really? Just so, you've never watched The Birdman of Alcatraz or Airport or any of his classics?
Do you know what? I have seen Birdman of Alcatraz. Actually, yeah. So it's my second Burt Lancaster film. But yeah, it was just so extreme. When they tie him to the cross and all of that stuff. I thought it was fantastic, I've got to be honest.
That torture scene reminds me of some of the stuff in your books. It goes for it when it comes to this sort of grisly horror element, the uber violence. I mean, this is a pretty nasty, bloody movie, and some of it reminds me of the stuff we see in your books. One of the things that I brought up was this issue of whether or not Valdez is seeking revenge or justice. Where do you come down on that, Andrew? What's that? That's something I'm going to bring up again in one of a later film as well.
That's a great question. I think that's the kind of the fine line. When I teach Introduction to Film Studies, I do a week on genre where I talk about how certain plots are conventional to different types of genres. And the way I describe a kind of conventional Western plot is, and this is a direct quote from my lectures, the Westerns are often about a hero seeking justice or vengeance or both, which speaks to that fine line between the two. And maybe it gets back to something I said in the intro as well, that there's always the sense that even if a character is acting beyond the bounds of the law, there's still kind of some higher law that they are an agent of. And there's always going to be these people that are able to transcend the corrupt institutions of the day and achieve a kind of higher form of justice. So I think this is the type of film that raises that question. But you have such a morally upright character in Valdez that the film doesn't ask that as a moral question. It really places all the blame onto Tanner. And the way that, as I said before, even Tanner's men come around and recognize the righteousness of Valdez's cause over such a minuscule thing is really one of the kind of the really, I guess, almost touching things about this movie that I like. It's kind of weird to say touching for such a brutal movie. But the way that he wins over his adversaries, he earns their respect, is one of the most enjoyable and rewarding things about this picture.
Valdez is coming. He carries a Colt 45 for close range, a sawed-off double-barreled shotgun for wide coverage, a Winchester 30-30 for rapid, endless firepower, and he carries a Sharps Buffalo gun for killing at 1,500 yards. Valdez carries enough equipment to stop an army because sometimes he has to. Burt Lancaster is Valdez.
So, Tony, what revenge western did you pick to talk about on today's show?
I revisited what might be my favourite western, Open Range, starring Robert Duvall, Kevin Costner, Michael Gambon and Annette Bening. Open Range was actually the first western movie I saw on a big screen. Earlier that summer I'd spent an afternoon watching Dances with Wolves and was blown away by the movie. When Open Range came out a week after my 19th birthday, I made sure to see it on opening day. Set in Montana in 1882, the film cast Duvall as Boss Spearman and Costner as Charlie Waite, both open-range cattlemen. Their group also includes Mose, played by Abraham Benrubi, and Button, played by Diego Luna. When they stop outside the town of Harmonville and Mose doesn't return from running an errand, Boss and Charlie ride in to free him from jail. Harmonville is run by an Irish rancher named Baxter, played by Gambon, who despises free grazers. When Baxter sends a posse of masked riders to try to spook them, Boss and Charlie disarm the riders at their camp. But when they return and find Mose dead, Button barely clinging to life, and even the camp's dog, Tig, killed, Boss and Charlie vow vengeance on Baxter and his gang of hired thugs. Costner produces, directs and stars in Open Range, much as he did in Dances with Wolves. The film was written by Craig Storper, based upon the novel The Open Range Men by Loran Payne. The inevitability that Boss and Charlie will seek revenge for Mose's murder is best summed up by Storper, who is quoted as saying, "These characters don't seek violence, but the notion that it's sometimes necessary is the Western's most fundamental ideal." Illustrating that point is the film's climactic gunfight, and Costner does not shy away from the reality of what it would be like to witness. Unlike other westerns where the townsfolk hang about to see who makes it, in Open Range they seek refuge outside of town, holing up in the church until the shooting is finished. A few of the local men Boss and Charlie have gotten to know join them in facing up to Baxter and his hired guns, and when the shooting starts, it is loud and the bullets are fired at close range. Costner is on fine form in this movie, but Duvall steals the show. It's my favourite performance of his. He dominates the screen, playing a part that was written specifically with him in mind. Costner has stated that if Duvall had refused to play Boss, he probably wouldn't have made the film at all, and that's easy to believe. It's a testament to Costner's ability to put his ego to one side that he gives Duvall top billing. An aspect of the movie I particularly enjoy is the switching of roles that occurs once Boss and Charlie seek revenge for Mose's murder. Out in the pastures, Boss is the boss, and Charlie follows his lead. But when they head into Harmonville to get their pound of flesh, the roles are reversed. The world of hurt is Charlie's domain. He is an old hand when it comes to killing, and in this regard Boss is the novice. Where Charlie once followed Boss's lead, now Boss finds himself trailing in Charlie's wake, as his protege faces the demons he has spent so long trying to escape. In many ways, Duvall's character is there to be the father, and it is the role of the father to nurture and protect his children. Costner's character, meanwhile, is a man who has walked away from violence and learned how to be civilised. But when Boss calls for vengeance, Charlie is forced to reacquaint himself with his violent side. The question then becomes, can he ever let the darkness go now that he has let it back in? To me, the film's romance between Charlie and Sue, played by Annette Bening, is there to assure us that he can eventually escape from violence again. It demonstrates that Boss did a good job in teaching Charlie how to be a better man. And when all the shooting is done, Charlie is able to embrace the possibility of a new life with Sue. He has proven that he can live with the worst parts of himself, accepting who and what he is, and carve a place for himself in a society he has shied away from for too long. And Boss, like any well-intended patriarch, is more than happy to see Charlie fly the nest.
I am so happy that you picked this film to talk about, mainly because our listeners are going to be really happy. This movie, the reputation that it has grown so much since 2003 when it first came out. I remember it didn't really make much of an impact at the time. Certainly it didn't have the sort of weight that Dances with Wolves had, or even Wyatt Earp, where they had this, there was more of a heft to those films. They were taking on a large mythology and a large storyline and characters. And this is much more of an intimate film. It's, it's equally as beautiful as those, the way it's shot, but it's a smaller scale film. It takes place over a much, much shorter period of time. It has a smaller cast of characters. So when it first came out, the general audiences didn't seem to respond to it. But over time, Western fans have just found this movie, and I hear them talk about it online so much more than I hear them talk about Dances with Wolves and Wyatt Earp. It's really a favorite of them, I think, because it feels like it's not a movie about Westerns, and it's not an action movie disguised as a Western. It's a legitimate Western drama, and it's really found its audience since 2003.
I think it always struck a chord with me when I watched it. And when I mentioned it to other people over the years, they were like, oh, they weren't too impressed by it. And I don't know, but I do feel the same way. I think over the years, I think it's got that sort of almost a cult, or maybe not a cult, but like a, it has got its reputation is there, and it's I love the film. I think I watched it so many times, and I think the only thing that didn't strike me when I watched it as a younger man was the romantic subplot, which I've read some critics thought it was extraneous to the rest of the film and all the rest of it. But I think as I've got older, I appreciate the romantic plot of the film. And it doesn't jar me at all. It totally complements where Charlie's transition from this sort of is a man that's sort of buried everything inside, and then he comes across this woman and just opens up. Yeah, it's just I love the film.
I think you're absolutely right, Matt, about the reputation that the film enjoys now. My sense is that it, along with maybe Tombstone and probably Lonesome Dove, are probably the three kind of Western properties from the past, 30 or 40 years that, at least among fans of the genre, seem to have the most purchase. And I think you're absolutely right that they lack the pretensions of a lot of films, of a Dances with Wolves, of an Unforgiven, of a Wyatt Earp, of a True Grit, or some other more recent Westerns that do try to kind of retell the story of the West, or have some kind of aim to comment on the mythology that's been built up. These are sincere and in some ways old-fashioned works. The other thing to emphasize is that this film was a real labor of love for Costner, who, as we discussed in our Wyatt Earp episode, loves the Western and has intervened in the Western at various points in his career to either attempt to bring it back, or at least attempt to bring it back. And he's certainly doing that right now with Yellowstone.
The revenge element is really strong here, too. It's not necessarily a movie I would consider a quote-unquote revenge Western. I often think of those as movies that are, the entire story is about a trauma in the past and trying to get at this, almost trying to heal thyself by killing everybody else or taking it out on people. Yeah. Here, we see the incident happen. It's not buried in the past, and it's one of the motivating factors, but it's really well done here, I think. There's an exchange late in the film between Boss and Charlie after the major gunfight has happened, where Charlie's about to execute somebody in cold blood, and Boss says to him, "We come for justice, not vengeance. Now them is two different things." To which Charlie replies, "Not today they ain't." Now, that is exactly what I was trying to get across in the VALDEZ is Coming comments, that where is that line? And for Boss, it appears that it's the cold-bloodedness of it, and it's the intention behind it. So I think that element of this film is a really good one, a really powerful one.
I mean, that's certainly a more conventional conception of right and wrong. I mean, one way to look at this film, and I know you won't like this, Matt, is Costner trying to make amends for Wyatt Earp. Because in many ways, this film is in a very direct dialogue with My Darling Clementine, right down to kind of the evil boss rancher, and the need to avenge a very recent injustice against one's, in this case, kind of extended family.
The look of the film is really amazing, too. I mentioned that it's an intimate film and that it's not as grandiose as Dances or Wyatt Earp. And yet, when I was looking into it, J. Michael Moreau shot it. And this was literally his first film that he shot. He was a new cinematographer at the time. He had directed some weird movies before that. This early 80s sleazy trauma movie called Street Trash. It's one of the nastiest horror films you'll ever see. I don't know how that guy ended up shooting this gorgeous movie with these beautiful sweeping landscapes and really has a great feel for nature. The rainstorm is a really powerful part of this film. So, hats off to J. Michael Moreau for shooting it, and for Michael Kamen for scoring it. Here's another composer who had never written a Western score before. Hard to believe. He had worked in so many different genres, and this was his one and only Western score, which is really remarkable. He does a fantastic job here.
I had the same question about Moreau, so looked him up, and he was actually a camera operator for James Cameron for a long time, and was also, I guess, the Steadicam operator on Dances with Wolves. So he would have had an existing relationship with Kevin Costner. So maybe he just needed the right opportunity, and also the right backdrop. This film was made very close to where I grew up, beautiful Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And it does probably the best job of any film I can think of depicting the beautiful Canadian Rockies as they truly are in all their majesty.
It is a gorgeous movie. When you mentioned that he had worked with Costner before on Dances with Wolves, that makes sense. Kamen had also worked with him before on Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. He wrote the score for that one as well. Special note about character actor Michael Jeter, who appears here. The film is actually dedicated to him. It was his last feature film before he died. He died that same year. And what a great actor. Fans of Costner will recognize him from his wonderful work in Waterworld. He's just, we lost an amazing character actor when Jeter died. There's nobody else like him.
Hold on there, Charlie. Hold on. I ain't looking over my shoulder the rest of my days. Charlie, you said we was going to kill them all. I aim to do just that. Well, kill them, not murder them. Splitting hairs, ain't you, boss? You do this, you ain't no different than Poole or Baxter or that gun hand of his that murdered Mose. Them killing Mose, how this started. Well, we come for justice, not vengeance. Now, them is two different things. Not today, they ain't. Step aside!
Listen to him, son. You done what you had to here because they give you no choice. Don't go making this into something bad.
This ain't the way, pard.
Okay, Andrew, and what is your second revenge Western?
My second film is Hannie Caulder from 1971. It was directed by Burt Kennedy, the most prolific Western filmmaker of the 1960s and 70s, and features what is assuredly one of the greatest casts ever assembled in a Western movie. Produced by Tygon British Film Productions and shot in Spain, Hannie Caulder stars Raquel Welch as a frontier wife whose husband is murdered by a rather inept gang of bank robbers called the Clemens Brothers, played by Ernest Borgnine, Strother Martin, and Jack Elam. The brothers then violently rape Hannie and burn her house to the ground, leaving her for dead. Hannie is found by a sympathetic bounty hunter named Price, played by Robert Culp, who agrees to train her to be a gunfighter so she can seek vengeance against the Clemens. Hannie Caulder is an example of what's often called the rape revenge film, about characters who are violently raped and left for dead, only to survive and exact vengeance against their rapists. Examples abound, and there are two very good books on the subject, one by Jacinda Reed and the other by Alexander Heller Nichols. Both include sections on the Western, and we'll include links to these books in the show notes. Reed observes that rape and revenge in the Western are not just standard motifs, but are often intimately connected. Examples include Rancho Notorious, The Searchers, The Last Train from Gun Hill, The Bravados, For a Few Dollars More, Chatto's Land, The Hunting Party, and The Last Hard Men, to name but a few titles. What distinguishes HANNIE CAULDER from these films and makes the film more like the conventional rape revenge film that we often associate with the horror film is that the female victim is the protagonist. At the same time, and in contrast to many Westerns with gun-toting heroines, HANNIE is able to acquire the supposedly masculine skills of a marksman without sacrificing her femininity. She does not, as Reed notes, have to choose between a male and female identity, but is instead able to negotiate between them. This is a credit, in large measure, to Welch's strong, silent performance. The actress was no stranger to the Western, having starred opposite James Stewart and Dean Martin in Bandolero, and opposite Jim Brown and Burt Reynolds in 100 Rifles. She is completely believable as HANNIE, both as victim and as gunfighter. While HANNIE CAULDER isn't without its problems, it remains the quintessential rape revenge Western.
Raquel Welch just gives such a great performance in this film. I mean, you cannot take your eyes off of her in this film. This is a big acting job, and she's more than up to the task. And the way Kennedy often shoots her from low angles, silhouetted against the blue sky, makes her look like this towering figure at times. It's really a wonderful collaboration between actress and director. It actually made me wish that she had been cast at some point in this period as a Bond girl, because I think she just would have blown Sean Connery's late period Bond right off the screen. This movie was actually made the same year that Diamonds Are Forever was made. And if they had swapped out Jill St. John with Raquel Welch, that movie just would have exploded, I think. This whole period of Burt Kennedy's filmography is one of, I think, the most interesting periods in his career. His movies started looking really good here. Early on, I always found them a little slapdash. And here, between this and The Train Robbers and his James Garner comedies, I think he really started putting together some really polished work. And HANNIE is the most interesting of the bunch. It's the most disturbing, the most complex, the most unique of all of those films. Were you familiar with this movie at all, Tony?
No. I don't think I've ever seen Raquel Welch either. So when I was watching it, I mean...
You're welcome.
Yeah, smoking hot. I mean, oh my God. But there was an aspect to this film that I stole for the fourth book I've just handed in, and that's when she's paying for their burials.
Oh, right.
She's paying for the bad guys' burials.
Did you really add that into the novel?
Yeah, I wrote it.
Oh, that's so awesome, because you saw the film before you started writing the fourth one. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Good to know.
You're welcome again. I have a question for the two of you, and this is something that I am kind of undecided on about this film, and that is, as I mentioned, how inept the Clemens brothers are. I mean, they are comically inept in this film, so there's a really almost uncomfortable contrast between the very violent gang rape early in the film and their ineptitude both before as well as subsequent to that. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Do you think it undermines HANNIE's heroism to a degree because she isn't matching herself against sort of top gunmen? What do you guys make of the way they're portrayed as so comedic?
It is, I mean, it's disturbing as all get out, that this nightmarish sequence that we get, and it's really an extended sequence, her attack scene, is committed by such dopes, such goofballs who are constantly doing physical comedy and silly gags. It makes it that much creepier in a way. So I find it really effective. And also maybe the fact that they're not particularly deadly shots, that they're not the worst of the worst and really skilled, makes it a little bit more believable that she could be trained enough in a short period of time to actually take them on. If they had been Henry Silva in some kind of like legendary villain, it was just, push the bounds of credulity. But here it actually works a little bit. I can imagine her taking on, Strother Martin or something. It is nice to see Jack Elam again. Maybe this, I don't know if this was before or after Support Your Local Sheriff, but to compare Elam's performance here with his absolutely lovable performance in that comedy. Shows his range. I mean, that guy could do light comedy and make you love him, and do this kind of menacing role and really make you just frightened as hell of him.
It was Jack Elam with the fly and the gun in Once Upon a Time in the West. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, what a face. I mean, that guy is just, you can't cast anybody better for a role like this than him. The rape scene itself isn't played comically. The characters are later on and before, but the scene itself is pretty serious. The camera work changes dramatically during it. We get these almost hallucinatory shots. The lens itself has this sort of weird, disturbing fisheye lens to it. It really feels like a bad dream is taking place.
Yeah, and I guess I would say too that it isn't an explicit scene. You know, we don't see nudity or blood or anything like that. So I wouldn't want that to put off people from seeing it. But it's impactful because of really what we don't see is one of these types of things. It kind of takes that Texas Chainsaw Massacre approach, that it's what you're filling in your own mind with the sounds that you hear, the brief snippets. Again, that hallucinatory cinematography that makes it all the more disturbing.
The way Kennedy continually superimposes the burning house onto her image of her writhing in bed, these nightmares. It's like he literally shows us that it's burned in her memory, that it's not going to leave there, and maybe killing these idiots isn't going to change that either. You can really see how influential this film was to Kill Bill. I think there's a lot of connections there. Hannie is very much like a bride character, and the two of them share a lot of similarities. Also, it must be mentioned that Courtney Hoffman, who we interviewed on the show, singled this film out as a big influence on her short western, The Good Time Girls, and revisiting it again for this podcast made that abundantly clear.
When the West had no laws and violence abounded, you needed a protector. Someone to watch over you.
Can I put my pants on?
You're not gonna need them for long.
Raquel Welch's Hannie Caulder. Hannie Caulder, a name you won't forget.
All right, Matt, what is your second revenge Western?
My second revenge Western is the 2014 German-Austrian co-production, The Dark Valley. Set in the late 19th century, the film opens with a mysterious American photographer named Greeter arriving on horseback in a remote Austrian village. After renting a room from a young woman named Luzi, Greeter soon discovers that the village is controlled by the Brenner clan, a despotic family of violent mountain men who've adopted a frightening medieval custom to maintain authority over the region. As the harsh winter season descends, Greeter quickly finds himself cut off from the outside world and unable to escape from the savage Brenner boys and their tyrannical father. Or could it be the other way around? Therein lies the mystery of this grim and brooding Euro-Western, which gradually evolves from an atmospheric drama to a cold-blooded revenge movie. Based on a best-selling novel by German author Thomas Willmann and directed by Austrian filmmaker Andreas Prochaska, The Dark Valley was submitted as Austria's official entry in the foreign language Oscar race, but it didn't end up being nominated by the Academy that year. Now, if you haven't heard of The Dark Valley before, well, you're probably not alone. Although it's developed a bit of a cult following over the last few years, outside of Germany and Austria, it didn't get much of a release. The film caught my eye initially, not because it was a Western, but because it starred British actor Sam Riley as Greeter. Thanks to his brilliant performance as Joy Division singer Ian Curtis in the award-winning biopic Control from 2007, I'm a major fan of Riley's work. His implosive performance in The Dark Valley reminds me at times of the great French actor Alain Delon, who often displayed a sense of elegant restraint in movies like Le Samurai and The Eclipse. I admit that I have a serious fondness for icy dispassion when it comes to leading men, so Riley's coiled self-control in the Dark Valley hits me right where I live. The film has a number of other things going for it, of course, including some truly breathtaking scenery. Shot in a mountainous region of Italy, cinematographer Thomas Keenest gives the rocky terrain and the snow-covered forests a fairy tale quality that's perfectly in keeping with the story's fable-like structure. At times, the Dark Valley almost feels like a Western-themed episode of Game of Thrones. The isolated village setting is like something out of a Brothers Grimm tale, and the medieval custom of prima noctis that the Brenner family follows adds a gothic horror element to the movie that I quite enjoy. And speaking of the Brenners, they are indeed a frightening crew of villains. The lead brother is especially chilling, in part because the actor playing him at times resembles rubber-faced comedian Jim Varney. Seriously, if they ever decide to make an Ernest Goes to Austria movie, actor Tobias Moretti is guaranteed the lead role. He's like Ernest's evil doppelganger. Another thing I admire about the film is the risky decision it makes to include a few well-chosen contemporary songs on the otherwise orchestral soundtrack. Normally that's something I don't really appreciate in Westerns, but the songs in the Dark Valley really worked for me. The movie opens with an excellent version of the American spiritual classic Sinner Man, performed by Austrian musician Clara Lucia. The spooky lyrics and Lucia's dreamy voice set a haunting tone right off the bat. Then much later in the film, a fantastic slow-motion gunfight is set to a powerful rock song by the band Steaming Satellites. The juxtaposition of sound and image in that sequence is really compelling. Now, it just so happens that the Dark Valley is yet another you effed with the wrong dude Western. Or in this case, you effed with the wrong dude's mother might be more accurate. Much like Valdez, Greeter is underestimated by his enemies, who mistake his youth and gentility for weakness. What they fail to grasp, however, isn't just the simmering rage lurking beneath his calm demeanor, it's also his technological superiority. You see, along with all of his fancy camera equipment, Greeter is outfitted with a Winchester repeating rifle, which the backwoods Brenner family is completely unprepared for. In the end, the Dark Valley is a gorgeously crafted schnitzel western that's loaded with intense performances, nightmarish violence, and a ton of religious symbolism. Just the way I like my revenge westerns.
I had not seen this film. I somehow missed it, so I'm really happy that you chose to talk about it, Matt. Like a lot of contemporary westerns, whether from the United States or elsewhere, it is packed with references and homages to earlier westerns. It's really a treasure trove for fans of the genre, everything from Shane to Ride the High Country to even Winchester 73. I think my favorite moment in the film is the one that you reference where the Brenners believe that our hero could only possibly have 2 shots left, being unfamiliar with the repeating rifle. There's a lot to like in this film. I also was struck by the resemblance between Sam Riley and Alain Delon. I immediately thought of Le Samouraï, and it seemed some of those initial shots were deliberate. You have these sort of long takes of a kind of placid, expressionless hero looking about, but you get the sense that there's something going on behind those beautiful eyes, something deadly.
Some of this movie reminds me in a way, Tony, of your book, The Devil's Snare. The opening sequence here where we have these cowering couple hiding out from some threat that's coming in. That's we don't know what's happening there. It could almost be a horror movie. And your book sort of begins with that where a family is beset by this group of figures who come rushing in. There's a kinship there, I think, between these two stories. What did you think of The Dark Valley?
I loved it. I only watched it last night as well, so I loved it. I thought it was like the way it was done like a fable. You know, he was this mysterious figure riding in, and you had the voiceover, and then he rode in, he enacted his vengeance, and then he rode off. I loved it. I loved everything about it, really. The cinematography of it was fantastic.
There's some really powerful scenes here, I think. One that I really love is the snowy logging scene where someone mysteriously dies on this log flume that they send the chopped down trees down. That sequence is really powerful. You can feel how physically difficult this life is for these people. There's that great moment where Greeter forces the innkeepers to eat some gold coins or something. That's right out of a Charles Bronson movie or something. It's hard to watch. And then There's that memorable sequence where he meets up with the priest who has been covering for the Brenners this entire time. And I really appreciate the practical special effect we get there when Greeter takes him out. It's like a direct reference to Taxi Driver, I think. He gets it through the palm into the head. It's a really scary moment there.
No, it's a really atmospheric film. You and I, Matt, have toyed with the idea of doing a winter westerns episode, and maybe we'll get to that at some point. But what I loved about this film was you not only get the valley, but it's quite green and verdant, but there are these references repeatedly to the winter, and that once the snow comes, you won't be able to get out. And the film really follows through. We sort of get this really wonderful scene where the snow does begin to fall and very quickly transitions into you feeling the full impact of what the winter is. But then our hero recognizing that it actually provides him with some kind of advantages. That's that whole moment of, as you alluded to, Matt, is he trapped there with them or are they trapped there with him?
What did you think about this other thing I mentioned, the music, the contemporary songs that are in there? It's not something that I usually go for. In fact, that new Netflix Western, The Harder They Fall.
The Harder They Fall.
I made it 20 minutes in before I had to turn it off. There was just too much wall-to-wall modern music going on for me. So how did that strike you here?
I agree with you that that's normally not something that I like. I mean, certainly sometimes anachronisms can work in a picture's favor, but it usually needs to be a more thoughtful approach than just putting in some modern songs. So I found that here a little bit discordant. I think that helps that the subject of the songs were more or less in keeping with what was happening, but I still found it a little bit jarring, I have to say.
It took me a few times to come around to it. I actually had to download them and listen to them a few times. Listening to them separately, they're really powerful songs, so it grew on me, I'll say that.
Well, and it's not as though there isn't a precedent for contemporary music. I mean, we don't think of the kind of ballads that we get in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid or True Grit as being contemporary songs, but at the time they were. I mean, Burt Bacharach starting to sing in the middle of a Western, or Glenn Campbell starting to sing in the middle of a Western. I mean, those were contemporary singers singing contemporary songs. So it's not like there isn't a precedent. I think it just may be our perspective that when we hear what we think of as a more contemporary rock and roll type song, it seems a little more out of place. Maybe that'll change with time.
Well, since we're talking about the music in the film, why don't we listen to a brief excerpt of the song that starts the film?
Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Cinnamon, where you gonna run to? Along them days, along them days. Hide me, runs to the rock saying, please rock hide me, runs to the rock saying, please hide me. Along them days, along them days, along them days, along them days.
Now, Tony, at this point in the show, I want to hear just a little bit more about your Ralph Compton Western novels. So, prior to writing The Devil's Snare, you were best known for writing detective novels, contemporary set detective novels. So how did you become involved in the Ralph Compton Western series?
I heard that a friend of mine, he was contracted to write one, and he had approached Berkeley with an outline and they took him on. So I thought, do you know what, I've watched so many Westerns over the years, and I've always I've always enjoyed the genre. I thought, I can do that. If I can write a police procedural, and I'm clearly not a policeman, Meg Gardner, the author, says it's lying for a living. And I think that sums up writing perfectly, because you don't necessarily have to ride a horse to write a Western or be able to shoot a gun. So I put together a pitch, sent it to them. They took me on for 3 books, and they had to be, I think I had 4 or 5 months to write the 3.
To write all 3 novels?
Quite rapid. Yeah.
Wow, that is a lot of books to write in a very short amount of time. How does it actually work? Does the publisher come to you with specific titles and plots that they want developed, or is it entirely the title and everything's up to you?
I gave them a list of maybe 12 different pitches. One was a train heist involving only women. There was all sorts of stuff, and they cherry picked the 3 that they liked the most. I think the Devil Snare. Yeah, actually, all 3 the titles were what I came up with. The 4th one that I've just handed in, The Guns of Wrath, was originally something else, and they asked me to come up with something better, and I just thought I'd just come up with some insane title, and they were like, oh yeah, we really like that.
That's funny that you just do it that way. Did you have to read any of the other Ralph Compton books? These are all standalones, correct?
Yeah, I never did. To be honest, by the time I sent the outline in and they agreed it and I'd signed a contract, I was already writing the first one. There was no time to do anything, to be honest. I just worked my way through one, sent it off, started the next one. It was a lot. Now,
the Devil Snare gets pretty gory at times. There's an axe murder that takes place late in the book that's particularly nasty, which I appreciated. So do you run into any problems with that type of violent content or weird content when you submit the draft? Do they ever send it back and say, this is just too much, we can't do this?
Surprisingly not. They're swearing, they're really against. I think it's just for the Ralph Compton, the line. But swearing is a big no-no. I did manage to sneak, I think, a few in there somewhere. I try and get away with stuff, so like snuck a swear word in there, or I reference, an actor there, or I reference a film there, but the gore and stuff, I didn't make it. It's bloodthirsty, but I tried not to make it too over the top.
Yeah, it's not gratuitous or anything, but I'm just saying you don't shy away from it. This is not like...
No.
These are... People get killed in these books. So one of the things I really love about the book, Devil Snare, is the weird villains that you came up with, particularly the trio of identical twin psycho females that you have there, and this giant, deadly Russian circus strongman who tears people apart. Those are not characters you see in a lot of Westerns. So where did they come from?
I think a lot of it was just trying to do things that I hadn't seen before, and I just thought I'll just throw in there. Yeah, as I was plotting it out, I thought I need like a big guy in this, and then I'm thinking, well, the biggest guy around at that time probably would have worked at a circus. He might have got pinched from a circus routine. And then I thought it makes total sense that, someone would employ someone of that size, if especially if they were handy. And I don't know, I threw in there anything I could possibly get away with, and I did get away with it as well. Just nutty stuff. The triplets.
It's pretty outrageous. So I'm sure people listening to this are going to want to pick up copies of it. And in the show notes for this episode, I'll have links to both your personal writer's website and links to where they can buy the books. So that way they can you can get your own copies and find out what all this craziness is about that Tony's come up with. So I just want to thank you again, Tony, for joining us on the show today. It's been a real pleasure having you on to talk about revenge westerns and about your books as well. And we hope that you'll come back in the future and give us an update on what you're publishing next.
Yeah, I'd look forward to that. Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure.
Oh, thanks for being here.
Well, that wraps up our show. Until next time, I'm Matthew Chernoff.
And I'm Andrew Patrick Nelson. And you've been listening to How the West Was Cast.
Well, that was our show. We thank you kindly for listening and hope you'll come back again real soon. Till then, keep your saddle oiled and your guns greased. We'll be seeing ya.